Robert and Martha Wilde appear to have it all. Married for 8 years, they were the epitome of success. Robert, a high-powered executive at a tech firm, and Martha, a rising star in the fashion industry, lived in a luxurious penthouse in Manhattan. Their son, Martin, was a bright and sensitive 8-year-old who adored his parents. From the outside, their life seemed flawless. But behind closed doors, the cracks were beginning to show. Robert was consumed by his work. Late nights at the office, endless meetings, and business trips had become his norm. He barely had time for Martha, let alone Martin. Martha, on the other hand, felt increasingly isolated. She had her own demanding career, but she longed for the emotional connection she and Robert once shared. The spark between them had faded, and their intimate moments had become rare and mechanical. Martha's assistant, Daniel, was everything Robert wasn't: attentive, empathetic, and always there. Daniel admired Martha not just as a boss, but as a woman. He noticed her loneliness and began to fill the void Robert had left. At first, it was innocent, lingering glances, casual compliments, and late-night conversations after work. But soon, the line between professionalism and desire blurred. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Martha found herself confiding in Daniel about her frustrations. He listened intently, his eyes filled with understanding. When he reached out to comfort her, their hands touched, and something shifted. Martha felt a rush of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. Guilt gnawed at her, but the warmth of Daniel's touch was too intoxicating to resist. The affair began slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started with stolen moments, a brush of fingers, a lingering hug, a whispered conversation in the office pantry. Martha told herself it was harmless, just a way to cope with the emptiness at home. But deep down, she knew she was crossing a line. Daniel, however, was all too willing to follow her lead. One rainy evening, after a company event, Martha and Daniel found themselves alone in her office. The tension between them was palpable. Daniel leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered, "You deserve to be happy, Martha." That was all it took. The dam broke, and they gave in to their desires. The guilt hit Martha immediately, but the thrill of being wanted overshadowed it for now. At home, Robert remained oblivious. He was too preoccupied with closing a major deal to notice the changes in Martha. She became more distant, more secretive, and less interested in their family life. Martin, however, sensed something was wrong. He noticed his mother's distracted demeanor and his father's constant absence. The once happy family dinners were now silent and awkward. Martha tried to justify her actions, telling herself that Robert's neglect had driven her to this. But every time she looked at Martin, her heart ached. She knew her choices would have consequences, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The affair became her escape, a temporary reprieve from the loneliness that had consumed her. Hey everyone, if you like cheating wife stories, please subscribe. Just one click helps us a lot. Thank you. As the affair continued, Martha's guilt grew heavier. She began to resent Robert for pushing her into Daniel's arms. Yet she couldn't deny her own role in the betrayal. Daniel, meanwhile, became more possessive. He wanted more than stolen moments. He wanted Martha to leave Robert and start a new life with him. Robert, still unaware of the affair, began to notice Martha's detachment. He tried to reconnect, but his attempts felt forced and insincere. One night, after another failed attempt at intimacy, Martha snapped, "You're never here, Robert. Not for me, not for Martin. Do you even care about us anymore?" Robert was stunned. He had no idea how to respond. Martin, caught in the crossfire, became increasingly withdrawn. He started having trouble at school, and his teachers noticed a change in his behavior. He missed the days when his parents would laugh together and spend time with him as a family. Now, all he felt was tension and sadness. Martha's double life was taking its toll. She was torn between her loyalty to her family and her growing feelings for Daniel. The affair, once a source of comfort, now felt like a prison. She knew she couldn't keep living this way, but she didn't know how to break free. The breaking point came on a cold November evening. Robert had been working late again, but this time, he decided to surprise Martha by coming home early. He stopped by her favorite bakery to pick up a cake, hoping it would brighten her mood. When he arrived home, the apartment was eerily quiet. He called out for Martha, but there was no response. Then he heard it, a faint sound coming from the bedroom. His heart sank as he approached the door, which was slightly ajar. What he saw inside shattered him. Martha and Daniel were entangled in each other's arms, oblivious to the world around them. Robert dropped the cake, the sound of it hitting the floor snapping Martha and Daniel out of their moment. Martha's face turned pale as she met Robert's eyes. "Robert, she began, but no words could undo what he had just witnessed. Daniel quickly grabbed his clothes and fled, leaving Martha to face the fallout alone. Robert stood frozen, his mind racing with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. Martha couldn't bring herself to answer. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the pain she had caused. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But her apology felt empty, even to her own ears. Martin, who had been playing in his room, heard the commotion and came running. He saw his father's devastated expression and his mother's tear-streaked face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling. Martha reached out to him, but Robert stepped in between them. "Not now, Martin," he said, his voice firm but gentle. The rest of the night was a blur. Robert packed a bag and took Martin to a nearby hotel. Martha stayed behind, alone in the apartment that now felt like a prison. She sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. She had lost everything: her husband, her son, and the life they had built together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Robert and Martin stayed at the hotel while Martha remained in the apartment, trying to piece together what was left of her life. She called Daniel, but he avoided her calls, leaving her feeling even more isolated. Robert, meanwhile, was consumed by anger and betrayal. He couldn't believe that Martha, the woman he had loved for so long, had shattered their family. He filed for divorce, determined to protect Martin from further pain. But as the days turned into weeks, his anger began to give way to sadness. He missed the life they had built together, even if it had been far from perfect. Martin, caught in the middle, struggled to make sense of everything. He missed his mother terribly, but he was also angry with her for breaking their family apart. His teachers noticed a change in his behavior. He became withdrawn and struggled to focus in class. Robert tried to shield him from the worst of it, but it was impossible. Martha, desperate to make amends, began attending therapy. She realized that her affair with Daniel had been a symptom of a much deeper problem: her inability to communicate her needs and her fear of being alone. She reached out to Robert, begging for a second chance. "I know I messed up, but I want to fix this," she said. Robert was torn. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to try to rebuild their family. But another part of him couldn't forget the image of her with Daniel. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he admitted. Martin, meanwhile, began seeing a child therapist. The therapist warned Martha and Robert that their son's emotional well-being was at risk. "Children are resilient, but they need stability and love," she said. The counseling sessions were painful and unproductive. Robert couldn't let go of his anger, and Martha couldn't let go of her guilt. The distance between them only grew, and Martin continued to suffer. Martha knew she had made a terrible mistake, but she was determined to make things right. She just didn't know if it was too late. Robert and Martha finally sat down to discuss their future. The tension in the room was suffocating. Robert wanted a divorce, but Martha begged for a second chance. "We can fix this, Robert. For Martin's sake," she pleaded. Robert was torn. He still loved Martha, but the betrayal was too much to forgive. He agreed to try counseling, but his heart wasn't in it. Martha, desperate to save her family, threw herself into the process. Martin, meanwhile, began seeing a child therapist. The therapist warned Martha and Robert that their son's emotional well-being was at risk. "Children are resilient, but they need stability and love," she said. The counseling sessions were painful and unproductive. Robert couldn't let go of his anger, and Martha couldn't let go of Daniel. The distance between them only grew, and Martin continued to suffer. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Martha received a call from Daniel. He wanted to see her. Against her better judgment, she agreed. When Robert found out, he was furious. "You're still seeing him?" he shouted. Martha's silence was all the confirmation Robert needed. He packed his bags and left, taking Martin with him. Martha was devastated. She had lost everything: her husband, her son, and the life they had built together. Martin, now living with Robert, missed his mother terribly, but he was also angry with her for breaking their family apart. Robert tried to shield him from the pain, but it was impossible. Martha, alone in the empty penthouse, realized the gravity of her mistakes. She had let her loneliness and desire for attention destroy everything she held dear. Martha's journey to redemption was neither quick nor easy. She began by ending all contact with Daniel, blocking his number and deleting his messages. It was a painful but necessary step. She knew she couldn't move forward if she was still clinging to the past. Next, she threw herself into therapy, determined to confront the flaws and insecurities that had led her down such a destructive path. Her therapist helped her unpack the loneliness and neglect she had felt in her marriage, but also held her accountable for the choices she had made. "You can't change the past," her therapist said, "but you can choose how you move forward." Martha also focused on rebuilding her relationship with Martin. She started by writing him letters, long, heartfelt apologies that she never sent. She knew he wasn't ready to hear her explanations, but the act of writing helped her process her guilt. When she did see him during their scheduled visits, she made sure to be fully present. She listened to him talk about school, his friends, and his favorite video games. She didn't push him to forgive her. She simply let him know she was there. Robert, meanwhile, was struggling with his own emotions. He had filed for divorce, but part of him still longed for the family they had once been. He started therapy as well, working through his anger and betrayal. Slowly, he began to see Martha not as the villain in their story, but as a flawed human being who had made a terrible mistake. One evening, after dropping Martin off at Martha's apartment, Robert stayed to talk. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he admitted, "but I see how hard you're trying. For Martin's sake, I think we need to figure out how to co-parent without tearing each other apart." Martha nodded, tears in her eyes. "That's all I want," she said. Over time, Martha and Robert found a rhythm in their co-parenting. They established clear boundaries and communicated more openly about Martin's needs. They even started attending family therapy together, though the sessions were often tense and emotional. Martin, who had been so withdrawn, began to open up in therapy. He talked about how confused and scared he had felt when his parents separated, and how angry he was at both of them for letting their family fall apart. Martha and Robert listened, their hearts breaking as they realized the full extent of the damage they had caused. "I'm so sorry, Martin," Martha said, her voice trembling. "We never meant to hurt you." Robert reached out and took Martin's hand. "We're going to do better," he promised. As the weeks turned into months, small signs of healing began to emerge. Martin started smiling again, and his grades improved. He even began to talk about the future, about summer camp, about high school, about the things he wanted to do when he grew up. Martha and Robert, though still navigating their own pain, found solace in their son's resilience. Martha also began to rebuild her life outside of motherhood. She threw herself into her work, channeling her energy into projects that challenged and inspired her. She reconnected with old friends and even started dating again, though she was careful to take things slow. She knew she still had a lot of healing to do before she could fully trust herself or anyone else again. Robert, too, began to move forward. He started dating as well, though he was cautious, wary of repeating the mistakes of his past. He focused on being the best father he could be, making sure Martin knew he was loved and supported. The divorce was finalized on a crisp autumn morning. Martha and Robert stood side by side in the courthouse, their signatures on the dotted line, marking the official end of their marriage. It was a bittersweet moment, acknowledgement of the love they had once shared, but also of the pain that had driven them apart. Afterward, they went out for coffee, a rare moment of peace between them. "I never wanted it to end like this," Martha said, stirring her latte. Robert nodded. "Neither did I. But maybe this is what we both needed, a chance to start over." Martin, now 10 years old, was thriving. He had adjusted to the new normal of split custody, though he still missed the days when his parents lived under the same roof. But he had learned to appreciate the little things: movie nights with his dad, baking cookies with his mom, and the occasional family outing where, for a few hours, it felt like they were a unit again. Martha and Robert, though no longer married, had found a way to coexist. They celebrated Martin's birthdays together, attended his school events, and even shared holidays. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Martha, now single and content, had learned to love herself in a way she never had before. She had faced her demons, made amends where she could, and forgiven herself for the rest. Robert, too, had found peace. He had let go of his anger and embraced the possibility of a new future. As for Martin, he had learned an important lesson, that even when things fall apart, they can be put back together, albeit in a different way. He knew his parents loved him, and that was enough to give him hope. The Wild family story was one of pain, betrayal, and redemption. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always the possibility of a new beginning. And sometimes, that new beginning is more beautiful than anything that came before.